Right, let's turn to this now. Zimbabweans will head to the polls in 10 days' time as the country battles with a struggling economy and depreciating currency. Some are pinning their hopes on the country's youth to help them in what's shaping up to be a hotly contested vote. For more on this, we join now by University of South Africa political science professor Everisto Benyera. Prof, good to have you, and thank you very much for your time and for joining us tonight here on In Focus. When you look at Zimbabwe, maybe even African countries broadly, but let's start with Zimbabwe. How would you gauge the country's ability to harness the democratic dividend, and how would you measure that degree of democracy, whether it's operating in that country?
Thank you very much, Tabo, for having me, and good evening to the viewers. The democratic dividend is obviously absent in Africa, no matter what method you use, and there is general consensus on the absence of the democratic dividend, to a point where others would ask, is the African problem really an African problem? Because over 50 years, the lived experience of people is actually stagnant in poverty or is actually deteriorating. There are two things that we want to look at here. The first one is reality. The second one is the reality. Reality is people that don't have water, electricity, poor service delivery across Africa.
Yeah.
And then the reality is that statistic that tells you that there is economic growth in Mozambique, that the GDP of Ethiopia is increasing. So statistics, economics, and the reality is telling you something that is completely different from reality on the ground.
Yeah.
What causes that? I think it is the pervasiveness of capitalism, how it entered into all aspects of life. Even the law, there's a price for the law.
Yeah.
The media, it's not free.
Yeah. So I looked at the democracy index, and I want you to stay there a little bit, because that index, for example, measures national elections. Are they free or fair? Security of voters, the influence of foreign powers on government, and the capability of civil servants to implement policy. So when they measure, for example, sub-Saharan Africa, we are looked at as flawed democracies. When they look at Middle and maybe North Africa, they're talking of authoritarian regimes. So let's look at sub-Saharan Africa, and what would, in your view, make our democracy to be flawed? If you look at the index on electoral democracy in Zimbabwe, do you believe Zimbabweans still have faith in the electoral system?
There is something that is called democratic fatigue. It is creeping in not only in Zimbabwe but across Africa. But now that we've asked a direct question, let me respond by giving you the findings of a research that was carried out by two reputable organizations, Afrobarometer of South Africa and its Zimbabwean partner, the Mass Public Opinion Institute. They carried out a survey before this election. The data was collected from 29 April to 13 May 2020. And the data was the findings were disseminated in Harare on 12 July 2023. What came out is very interesting for various reasons and from various angles. Firstly, 54% of polled Zimbabweans believed that elections don't work in Zimbabwe. And the corollary to that, therefore, what is the alternative when elections fail? Others have even asked, what is the purpose of elections in the post-colonial? Is it to authenticate a leadership or to select a leadership? By extension, if you may allow me, what is the best vehicle for managing power politics in the post-colony?
Yeah.
Is it the family, the Ayademas in Togo? They've been there for a very long time. Is it the military, sometimes in Nigeria and currently in Egypt? Is it secession, we have created new countries in Africa, South Sudan and Eritrea. Or maybe it is the politics of long incumbency. Paul Biya in Cameroon, Denis Sassou Nguesso, and Eduardo dos Santos in Angola. Or maybe the best vehicle for managing political transitions and power politics in Africa is the monarchy, the kingdom of Eswatini, Lesotho, and Morocco. How best do we manage power politics in Africa? We haven't found a model that works for us because everything seems to be problematic. Ethnic federalism is not working in Somalia. Clan-based politics is not working. Clan-based politics in Somalia and ethnic federalism in Ethiopia. So how do we manage power in the post-colonial? We haven't found the best model. Back to the results of the pre-elections in Zimbabwe. And the proviso here is that these results are indicative of people's preferences 3 months before elections. Sure. And people's perceptions change overnight.
So, Prof, if we then go back to that, if we're saying we don't have a way of bringing in power and dealing with power on the African continent, and the electoral democracy index would be quite low, would you say because that is ineffective, it also, for example, affects the liberal democracy index, where is a measure of the principle of rule of law, checks and balances, and civil liberties? Because some of the other countries we see they will tell you that there's a rule of law, maybe sometimes ruled by military or whatever, the police forces, that they're saying, no, this is a country, for example, Zimbabwe will tell you, this is a country of laws, there are checks and balances here. You can't just go willy-nilly and do whatever you want.
Mr. Mdluli, the question that we have posed is a very fundamental question. And I want to complicate it slightly by posing another question on top of a question. What measure do we use to ascertain authenticity? Is it the test of the law or the test of legitimacy? Something could be legal but illegitimate. And I can give you a controversial example. When President Jacob Zuma went into prison for less than 2 hours and walked out a free man, what happened there is completely legal, but is it legitimate? The warrant of arrest that was given on President Vladimir Putin is legal, but is it legitimate? Because if it is legitimate, then Barack Obama must also get his, George Bush must also get his, Tony Brown must also get his, and they must join President Vladimir Putin at The Hague.
Let's take it further there. The descending of the ECOWAS bloc in Niger, yes. Is it legal? Is it legitimate?
What ECOWAS is doing is both illegal and illegitimate. Why do I say that? Because there are African leaders in the ECOWAS region who first perpetrated coups on their own people. Right now, President Tinubu's legitimacy is being contested in his own country. If you look at Cote d'Ivoire, President Alassane Ouattara, the way that he came into office and the way that he extended his term of office. So by imposing a third term, you are actually perpetrating a coup on the people. And then when the military then counter-coup you then complain. So what is happening in West Africa is a macrocosm of the failures of the post-colonial project. What do I mean by that? Rewind to 1958-1960, when General Charles de Gaulle offered the Francophone countries political independence, but he retained 4 aspects of their economies. The finance is controlled by France, the military is by France, the natural resources by France, and the international relations by France. So these countries have got pseudo-independence. This is why we are seeing a popularity of so-called military coups. I'm saying so-called because the United States has not yet condemned it for its own national interest. So it's very complicated, Mr. Mdluli, what is happening in West Africa. If President Tinubu and the remaining ECOWAS leaders intervene militarily, the risk is that they can start an ECOWAS Arab Spring, which may ironically lead to their own ouster, because they are also sitting on hot seats in their own countries. So these are unprecedented times where France must come back and renegotiate because it needs the uranium from Niger so that it can fire its nuclear-powered power stations. It's a very complicated issue. Unfortunately, we don't have time.
No, which brings me to the next question, because if you look at the Democratic Index, one of the things that it measures, as I mentioned, is the influence of foreign powers on governance, right? So if we look at Zimbabwe and why we could call it a flawed democracy, to what extent is the interference of or the influence of foreign powers in the governance in Zimbabwe at play?
Look, it is very interesting because there are very huge contestations about the parameters that goes into measuring what constitutes a democracy, what constitutes a flawed democracy, what constitutes a viable democracy, and which one has got more weight than the other in terms of those parameters. That is where the politics comes in, because those that develop these indexes are not doing so out of their own benevolences, but they are doing so in order to perpetuate a certain narrative, a narrative that says Zimbabwe is a failed state. But at what stage do you start the narrative of Zimbabwe? Where, when Zimbabwe was being colonized or when Zimbabwe was retaking its land, what accounts for the fact that Zimbabwe has so much gold resources, yet it does not have a currency? And there is so much gold in the United Kingdom, yet it does not have a single gold mine. How come we never get Malawi to go and observe and authenticate elections in the United States, and Malawi issuing a statement that the elections in the United States were free and fair, free and credible, free and acceptable, or any other cousins of the free and fair family? Right now in the United States, the supposedly biggest democracy, we are coming into another elections when there are still contestations and dark clouds over the previous election, but nobody is sanctioning them. Nobody is saying that America is a flawed democracy.
So is free and fair working as a criteria to judging electoral outcomes?
Free and fair does not work because free is a political parameter. Fair is an administrative parameter. And when you bring politics and administration together, it becomes very convoluted. Hence these other cousins, free and acceptable, free and whatever. And there is no agreed parameter of saying if two constituencies were experienced irregular voting behavior and whatever, then the rest of the elections are not free and fair. If there was political violence at one polling station, if one polling station in a constituency opened late, then the elections were not free and fair. There is no agreed upon matrix that say if this happens to this extent, then free and fair comes in. Which brings me to my next question, which is why are we not as Africa taking our democracies to a better standard, which is of election monitoring away from election observation? Then we stay in that mode of election monitoring for a period before we move to electoral supervision, where things can be corrected at the polling station, as opposed to observing where you write a report, then you give it to the government and hope that they will remedy the situation. I think we need to migrate from electoral observation to electoral monitoring as a panacea of this free and fair mantra.
Prof, appreciate your time. Time always the enemy. I just have to leave it there for tonight. University of South Africa Political Sciences Professor Everisto Benyera. In Focus continues shortly with what's making news tonight. Stay with us.